Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the recently released MILVIZ PC-6 Porter. Really exciting to have another release from MILVIZ within Microsoft Flight Simulator. They've certainly proven themselves to be one of the best developers for the sim to date. Obviously previously they gave us a warbird in the form of the FG-1D Corsair. Now we have the Porter, a civilian aircraft, which I think is going to be really good fun in the sim. Certainly for anyone that's into their economy style add-ons, so Air Hauler, Neofly, FS Economy, I think the Porter is going to be a really ideal aircraft for that. Once again, being a MILVIZ aircraft, I'm expecting really high levels of detail, certainly an aircraft with lots of character and immersion. And of course, in today's video, which is a full review of the aircraft, we're going to aim to find out exactly whether or not that's true. The flight today is one I'm quite looking forward to. We're currently on the ground at Moanemani airstrip in Indonesia. And we're going to be making a short hop out towards the northeast to the airstrip of Bugalaga. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with Bugalaga from the Microsoft Flight Simulator landing challenges. It's a really interesting strip to operate into. It should be a really nice test for the Porter. There's also quite a bit of weather in the area, as you can see currently behind us. That should make the flight all the more interesting. We're probably going to have to work around that as we go. And a nice little option with the Porter, we'll talk more about it in a moment's time, but we do actually have the option to visually load cargo onto the aircraft, which I think is nice, it adds to the immersion. So we'll be making a little bit of a cargo run up towards Bugalaga today. Anyway, as I say, the video is a full review, so as usual we'll first look at the external and internal modelling and texturing of the aircraft. We'll carry out a full startup, a full flight over towards Bugalaga. We'll take a look at the external model a little bit more en route. Once we've landed, we'll shut the aircraft down and I'll give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll always do my best to answer them. For the time being, it looks as though that storm cell is going to sit rather stubbornly off to the northwest, so we'll take the opportunity to look at the external and internal modelling and texturing of the aircraft. Hopefully the weather will have cleared through a little bit by the time we get airborne. So the first thing to say about the poor old little Porter, and even MILVIZ mention it themselves in the manuals, the aircraft is not a very pretty machine, I think it's fair to say. It's not an aircraft that I'm all that familiar with personally, but looking at pictures of the real-world aircraft, it does seem that MILVIZ have done an excellent job of recreating the real-world PC-6. As I say, to me the aircraft does seem to be a little bit ungainly, but that is somewhat exacerbated by the wide-angle lens that we tend to get in Microsoft Flight Simulator as well. Overall, proportionally, the airframe does seem to be, again, very well modelled, seems to be very accurate. As I say, it's not an airframe that I'm all that familiar with, so I'll have to leave you to pick apart the finer details for yourself. Modelling though throughout, as far as I could tell, very little to fault. Overall the aircraft is done to a very high standard. The PC-6 is obviously a pretty utilitarian aircraft, and I think that MILVIZ have really given it that feel. Certainly in terms of the texturing, everything done very nicely. I will say that the textures are not the highest resolution that I've seen in the sim, a little bit similar with the FG-1D Corsair. And indeed, strangely, some of the best add-ons in the sim do seem to have slightly lower resolution textures. My assumption is always that that's based around FPS saving. That being said, the textures are still very nice and crisp and clear, and as you can see they're done very accurately. There's no real bleeding around any of the airframe. Similarly, I couldn't find any particular defects in the modelling, no areas with particularly low pixel count. As you can see, the level of detail throughout the aircraft is really rather high. Even the more intricate, finer areas of the aircraft have been modelled very well. And here I think you can see a good example. The textures are not the sharpest, the most details that I've seen on any aircraft, but they certainly do a very nice job of recreating the worn and weathered feel of the Porter in action. In terms of liveries, the aircraft comes with 8, all of them very nicely done, a little bit of variety there as well. We have a military option for example, so that's nice to see. The Porter is really at its heart a Sherpa of the skies. As you can see, we have a nice big cargo area. We can also fit the aircraft out with passenger seats. And the PC-6 will get your passengers or cargo from A to B under some quite trying conditions, as you'll see today. It's very much a STOL-capable aircraft. As one might expect from a higher tier Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on, we have an accompaniment of various fixtures and fittings to the aircraft. For example, you can see here we have chocks, tie-downs, engine intake covers, things of that nature. As usual, they can all be selected through an onboard EFB. We'll talk more about that in just a moment's time. And lastly, just a quick look at the cockpit from the outside. As you can see, again, a very nice job in terms of the modelling. So as far as the external modelling and texturing of the aircraft goes, as I say, I can't really find too much to fault there. The modelling is certainly a very high standard, and the texturing isn't too far behind. Overall, a really nice job, as you'd expect from MILVIZ. Coming now then into the cockpit, and once again a really nice effort internally on the aircraft. I think it's fair to say that the texturing internally is actually a little bit better than the texturing externally. Overall, once again, MILVIZ have created an aircraft that has a lot of feel, a lot of character to it, and I think the textures really help with that. As you can see, even zooming in towards the panel, everything holds up very nicely. It's very crisp and very clear. The aircraft at the moment does make use of the default Asobo G1000, which is a little bit of a shame, but MILVIZ have stated that the next stable release of the working title mod will be compatible with the PC-6. Throughout most of the cockpit, the modelling and the texturing is pretty exemplary overall. As you can see, the level of detail there on the throttles, really nice to see. We've got the linkages coming off from the levers, and the texture is really well weathered in the appropriate places. Pretty much every switch, if not every switch, seems to be modelled in the cockpit. Certainly everything was functional that I needed to carry out a full flight from cold and dark start using the MILVIZ provided checklist. In the interest of fairness, I will say that there are some areas of the cockpit that aren't up to quite the same standards. As you can see, for example, the textures down on the fuse box there are a little bit more cartoonish, a little bit less realistic than we saw up on the panel above. But again, overall a really nice effort with the aircraft internally. As you can see, the cargo bay is done just as well in terms of texturing and modelling. We've got the fire extinguisher, for example, down on the back of the pilot's seat there. And again, we'll touch more on the cargo side of things in just a moment's time, but we'll first just take a look, finishing up in the cockpit with the night lighting. Night lighting in the cockpit, whilst not absolutely stunning, is certainly very acceptable. We of course have your basic instrument lighting, and we also have a cabin light which tends to illuminate much of the cockpit as well. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the aircraft does come with its own onboard EFB. As you can see, we have a series of options available. Primarily, we have a configurations tab for the aircraft. We also have the option to choose our passenger or cargo loading. In terms of configuration, it really comes down to the external fixtures and fittings that you'll have seen earlier. So as you can see, we can choose to fit an exhaust cover, intake cover, propeller tie-downs, pitot cover, tie-down blocks, chocks. We can also fit skis. I gather that Tundra tyres and various other options will be coming later on to the add-on. We also have the choice to fit a weather radar pod, and finally we can fit the aircraft with external tanks to extend our range. In terms of the internal configuration of the aircraft, fairly straightforward there, but we have the option to remove both the captain and the co-pilot models. One of the features that I really like with the aircraft, as you can see, we can choose our passenger or cargo loadout. We can switch between passenger seating and load passengers accordingly, although there's no visual model there, it's just weight. The feature that I really enjoy though, if we go to cargo loading, we can actually change the amount of cargo we have on board, and we'll get a visual representation of that accordingly. The first cargo option actually allows you to set cargo via a trapdoor system so that you can drop the cargo en route, and I believe that does function correctly in the aircraft. After that though, we're just loading up various crates and pallets, and as you'll see, as we increase the cargo quantity, so too we see a visual representation down the back. A quick look down the back with a full cargo load. As you can see, we've got a couple of crates there, a little duffel bag as well. Again, I think that's a really nice feature. For me, it really adds to the immersion if you are doing an air hauler run, for example, to see that you are actually carrying something in the aircraft. Anyway, overall, once again, I think MILVIZ have done a really nice job with the add-on. It's really what you'd expect from them, but nonetheless, it's great to see. As I say, I think the Porter is going to be a really fun aircraft to have in the sim, really well suited to the type of flying that most people tend to do in Microsoft Flight Simulator. MILVIZ, for me, are one of the best developers in terms of creating an aircraft, as I said, with character and immersion, and I'm really keen to find out whether or not that's the case with the Porter. So of course, the best way to find out if any of that's the case with this particular add-on, we'll head for the cockpit and we'll get the aircraft started up. So welcome to the cockpit of the MILVIZ PC-6 Porter. As you can see, the worst of the weather is now cleared through the area, so we'll get the aircraft started up and up in the air. The before start checks, the doors are closed and locked, seats and rudder pedals have been adjusted. Flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. Parking brake is set. Power lever is in the idle detent. Idle control lever is in the cut-off position. Propeller control lever can go fully forward. We're well above 10 degrees Celsius outside today. Starter switch is off. Ignition switch is off. Generator, auxiliary fuel pump and landing light switches are off. Avionics bus switches are off. Avionics bus tie is out. I'm not entirely sure how accurately that's modelled. I would imagine you pull out the entire collar there on the breaker, but I could be wrong on that one. Battery master switch is on. Fuel system valve is open and gated. Avionics bus 1 is on. We'll just wait for the Garmin G1000 unit to initialise. So we'll just cancel the warning. We have a generator low voltage, fuel pressure low, and battery discharge. We're expecting to see all of those at the moment, so we'll cancel the warning and we'll cancel the caution. Fuel quantity is checked. We have 50% fuel in each main tank. I believe that equates to about 160 litres in each tank. Engine instruments are checked. All temperature, we're looking for above minus 40 degrees Celsius for the start. Of course, we're well above that today. Lights, so the nav lights are already on. Beacon can go on for the start. And the start checklist, auxiliary fuel pump is on. Propeller area is clear. We'll open up the DV window. Clear prop! And we can close that again. So we can engage the starter. Keep an eye on the oil pressure. We'll wait for that to stabilise in the green band. Already up through 12% on the NG, so we can introduce the fuel in just a moment. So oil pressure's looking good. Ignition can go on. And we'll move the idle control lever to the low idle position. Looking for a max ITT there of 1090 degrees Celsius, so you can see we've peaked below that. And just wait until we see 46% on the NG. There's 46%, so the starter can come off. Same for the ignition. Oil pressure's looking good. We'll just wait for the engine to stabilise. We're looking for a stabilised ITT below 660 degrees Celsius. And it looks like we're stabilised around 527, so well within limits. The after start checks, propeller control lever is fully forward. Generator switch can come on. NG, we're looking for a stable NG above 51%. We're showing 54, so that's again within limits. Avionics bus 2 can come on. Avionics tie can go in. And we'll initialise the avionics for the departure. So we'll set runway heading. Departing off runway 21. Can't see the windsock at the moment, but the wind was favouring 21 earlier, so we'll go with that for now. We'll set our altimeter. Planning initially on cruising at an altitude of 9,000 feet. We may have to adjust that throughout the flight, dependent on the weather and the terrain. And we'll tune up traffic. We've already got that tuned. That's 122.9. So the avionics are set for the departure. The before taxi checks. Cargo is secure. Landing light can come on. Nav lights are on. Tail wheel is set to steer. Pull up traffic, tell them that we're departing runway 21. We'll be out to the north.
Whiskey Alpha November Juliet traffic Pilatus Papa Kilo. Uniform Charlie Foxtrot taking off runway 21 departure to the north.
Okay, so we'll reset the caution once again. We'll take a look at our alerts page. Nothing pertinent there. Heart brake can come off. We'll come up on the power. Just keeping a good eye there on the engine temperatures and pressures as we do so. The aircraft does need quite a bit of power to get moving initially, but we're now on the roll. And just checking, all clear upwind, and all clear on final. So we'll just backtrack runway 03, then we'll make a 180 turn down at the end for runway 21. In terms of ground handling, the aircraft handles pretty nicely on the ground. The rudder, I would say, is probably a little bit sensitive, so it'll be interesting to see how that is for the takeoff. Anyway, we'll start running our before takeoff checks. So the elevator trim is set neutral, aileron trim is set neutral. Rudder trim, we want 7 degrees out to the right for the takeoff, and that is set. Flaps, we're looking for flaps 28 for the takeoff. The flap switch does seem to be one of the few things in the cockpit that's not currently modelled. You can see the windsock there is fairly dead. Looks like we've got a slight crosswind out from the left for the takeoff. So the flaps are set. Flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. Altimeter is set. Fuel quantity is checked. Auxiliary fuel pump is on. Anti-ice and prop de-ice not required. Engine instruments are checked. Heating control is off. Doors and windows are closed and locked. And we'll just wait until we're aligned with the runway centerline before we complete the checklist. So just coming off the power to let the aircraft slow down. We'll swing out to the right initially to make our 180-degree turn. Coming onto the brakes. Got full left rudder there now. As you can see, the aircraft pretty much turns on a dime. And just getting ourselves lined up with the runway centerline. So back on the brakes. Park brake can go on. And completing the checklist. So tail wheel lock. Can go to locked. Rudder pedals are full and free. Idle control lever can go to the high idle position. And we'll just wait for the engine to stabilise there at high idle. So the engine looking good. As usual, we'll just head outside briefly, take a listen to the engine sounds whilst we're idling here on the runway, and then we'll come back to the cockpit and get ourselves ready for the departure. So as you can see, we've just got a little bit more weather passing through the area here at the moment, but it's good enough for the departure, so the park brake can come off. Start coming up on the power. It'll be interesting to see how the aircraft performs during the takeoff roll, given that it is fairly sensitive in terms of its ground handling. So just using a bit of right rudder here at the moment to keep the aircraft straight on the centre line. Overall, that rudder definitely quite sensitive, very much like most aircraft in the sim. Anyway, we'll just climb initially at 70 knots, just to get above the treetops. And now that we're clear of the tree line, we'll pitch for a climb of 80 knots until we've got the aircraft clean. We'll wait until we're through 300 feet above aerodrome elevation to start retracting the flaps. And there's 300 feet. Just retract the flaps in stages. And we'll pitch now for a climb of 90 knots. Just coming up through 500 feet, so we'll start our turn back towards the northeast. Try and keep a fairly tight turn here just to avoid that bank of weather out on our left. Just have a quick look at the ITT there, we're good at the moment. We'll see how we go. We'll look for a heading of about 030, but we might have to come out to the north initially just to avoid the weather. Just see the airfield out there at our 10 o'clock. And as I say, I think we'll keep coming around to the north, just keep visual with the terrain, clear of the worst of the weather. So we'll come into a heading of about 340 for now. Overall, I have to say the aircraft is very nice to hand fly. It's with the exception of the takeoff and the rudder there, it handles very well in terms of a feeling of weight and inertia to the aircraft. It's also very smooth, as you can see. That rudder trim seems to be taking care of any engine aerodynamic forces. No rudder input required at the moment. Anyway, the climb checklist, the flaps are up, auxiliary fuel pump is off, oil temperature is checked, landing lights can come off, heating is not required. ITT we're looking for a max of 695, we'll come back slightly now on the power for the climb, come back to around 95% there on the NG. Just coming up through 7,500 feet, so another 1,500 feet to climb at the moment. We'll actually come just slightly further left here as well, we'll make our way over the lowest point in the terrain. So as you can see, we're more or less on a 90-degree tangent here at the moment from our desired flight plan, but again, don't want to fly through that weather with the high terrain such that it is. Anyway, we'll climb up to 9,000 feet, we'll get the aircraft trimmed off, we'll see how stable or not the aircraft is as a platform. Once we've done that, we'll try the autopilot. I have to say I've had mixed results with the autopilot so far. It worked absolutely fine on the first go. It's one to go, by the way. Worked absolutely fine on the first go, but unfortunately it seems once you've used it once, it seems to then want to hunt for the heading quite strangely. So we'll try heading hold. Obviously at the moment the aircraft is using the default Asobo avionics, so you have all of the issues associated with that. But as I mentioned, MILVIZ have stated that the aircraft will be fully compatible with the next stable version of the working title mod, so hopefully that would fix up any issues that the aircraft currently has. So we can just start easing the aircraft back round towards the north now, as you can see. A little bit of an opening in the weather. Everything looking good there on the temperatures and pressures. So another 500 feet to go. Getting a little bit bumped around here from presumably a little bit of mechanical turbulence just coming off the hills. But this is exactly the kind of flying I think the Porter is really well suited to. Obviously the terrain and the weather here in Indonesia making for a really nice challenge, and there's nothing more fun than hauling some cargo or a few passengers around in these sorts of conditions. As I say, I think the PC-6 is really at home in this sort of environment. Again, I think we can just start eking the aircraft back round to the northeast. You can see the ridgeline of the hills off in the distance there. And just coming up on 9,000 feet, so we'll start levelling the aircraft off, trimming accordingly. A little bit of a rainbow there for 1 o'clock, which is rather nice. This sim absolutely does weather better than any other sim by far. Anyway, speed's building up. The aircraft definitely wanting to fly right wing down at the moment, so we'll start taking out that rudder trim. And we'll come back to around 90% on the NG for the cruise. That seems like a reasonable cruise power setting. So I've got the aircraft more or less trimmed now for straight and level flight. Just get levelled off there. Hands off the controls, and as you can see the PC-6 is a very nice stable aircraft once you have it trimmed. Even with some mild bumps here off the hills, still maintaining straight and level very well there, which is great to see. So moment of truth, we'll give the autopilot a go. If it does anything strange we're just going to take it straight out again, but one way or another we'll demonstrate if it has any issues or not. So we'll centre up the heading bug, get the autopilot on, and as you can see the aircraft straight away they're wanting to roll off away from the direction of the heading bug, which as I said does seem to be a little bit of an issue with the aircraft at the moment, in as much as it doesn't always go in the logical direction onto heading. It sometimes goes through 360 degrees to get you back on heading. So we'll try setting 070, see what it does there. Yeah, once again, not really functioning as it should at the moment. I have had it working previously, so it does in theory work, and I'm sure if we let it go through a 360 degree rotation it would come back onto the heading bug, but quite aggressively, and it will often not hold altitude either as a result. So the autopilot needing a bit of work there at the moment, but as I said, ultimately the blame lies at Sobo's door on that one, although hopefully MILVIZ will get the aircraft compatible with the working title mod fairly soon. Otherwise the autopilot at the moment a little bit of a non-starter. Give it one more go, just switch briefly into nav and then back to heading, see if that does anything to fix our issues. It does seem to be a little bit less aggressive this time, at least in terms of coming onto the heading, but nonetheless it's not really doing what we want, as you can see. So looks like it's going to be a fairly manual leg over towards Bugalaga today. come back round to face out towards the northeast. We'll just get the aircraft levelled off once again. We'll take a quick look at some of the performance data. So looking pretty good there on the heading now. As you can see, we've cleared the worst of the weather for the time being. So in terms of performance at the moment, as you can see, we've got 91% there on the NG. We're doing 52 gallons per hour in terms of our fuel flow. In terms of our TAS, we're doing about 115, 120 knots there at the moment, 9,000 feet. So overall, one of the really nice things about the Porter is in terms of altitude, it's a very high performance aircraft, but as you can see in terms of speed, not so much. We're doing about 105 knots indicated. So this aircraft, as I say, I think it's really ideal for your air haulers or your neo flyers, things of that nature, but just be aware you're not going to be getting anywhere in a particular hurry. There'll be plenty of time to take in the scenery as you go. And speaking of scenery, we'll do exactly that. We'll head outside the aircraft as usual. We'll take in the external model in a little bit more detail, and of course we'll appreciate the awesome terrain and weather of Indonesia. As usual, I'll come back to you again just as we start our approach into destination. So welcome back to the cockpit. As you can see, we are just approaching and bound towards Bugalaga at the moment. We've got the airstrip just passing off the left wing. The autopilot is currently flying the aircraft, so it does work. It's just very temperamental in terms of mode engagement and capture at the moment. Again, hopefully MILVIZ will fix that up in fairly short order. Anyway, we'll disengage. We'll come back on the power. We'll start a descent. Unfortunately, my Azure text-to-speech voice has died en route. That seems to happen a lot in the sim at the moment for me, so we won't be making any further use of the default air traffic control system. But what we'll do, we'll overfly the runway, make sure everything's clear, check the general surface condition, try and get sight of the windsock as well. Then we'll come back around for a bit of a left-hand orbit, back in towards the westerly runway. We'll get our before landing checks out of the way, so the altimeter is set, fuel quantities are checked. As you can see, we've got about 25% in each main tank there at the moment. Auxiliary fuel pump can go on, as can the ignition. Idle control lever is in the high idle position. Trims are set. Heating controls are off. Landing lights can go on. And the tail wheel is locked. Let's see before landing checklist complete. Just coming back towards the field right now, coming through 8,300 feet at the moment. As you can see, Bugalaga is a pretty interesting little airstrip. It's basically just carved out into the side of the hill. Pretty significant upsloping runway, quite undulating as well. So it does make for quite a challenge. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it from the Sims landing challenge. And if you haven't given that landing challenge a go, I highly recommend it. It's really good fun. Anyway, it looks to be that the runway is clear. We'll keep an eye out for the windsock. Looks like we're going to have a very slight crosswind out from the left. Obviously we're pretty committed to landing out towards the west anyway with the upslope on the runway. The parking area is just up at the top end of the runway, and as you can see there's a pretty significant slope between us and the touchdown zone, so we'll have to carry quite a bit of speed on the landing. We'll probably aim to come over the threshold around 65 knots and carry most of that speed up the hill. Anyway, we'll track outbound, and then as I say we'll make a left-hand orbit back onto the westerly runway. We'll more or less just follow the contours of the hills. Downwind checks, the brakes are checked and off, undercarriage is down, mixture is rich, fuel pump is on, fuel quantities are sufficient, instruments are checked, landing lights are on, harness is secure. Keep an eye on the airstrip as best we can. As to be said, visibility in the PC-6 is not particularly brilliant. That is one of the challenges of flying the aircraft. It's a little bit tricky to maintain situational awareness on an approach such as this. But as I say, that is one of the challenges. It's one of the things that makes the aircraft quite good fun to fly. Anyway, just following the contours of the hills, we'll straighten up momentarily just to get eyes on the runway again. Everything looking good so far in terms of our profile. We'll just pitch the aircraft up slightly, we'll let the speed bleed off so that we can start taking some flap. Just coming back on the power slightly more. So we'll take stage flap. A little bit high still at the moment, so we'll come all the way back to idle power, we'll come all the way down to landing flap. So flaps are set. Obviously one of the PC-6's party tricks is it can fly an incredibly steep approach, but we won't do that just now. I'll demonstrate that later on in the video. Anyway, landing checks, pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set, landing clearance is not required, the runway is clear. Again, unfortunately no air traffic system, so we won't be calling final. Getting a little bit bumped around here, a little bit of turbulence off the hills. Just triggering the stall warning there momentarily. We do have some trees over the threshold end of the runway, so we'll come in a little bit high just to clear those. Overall the aircraft flies very nicely in the approach configuration. Again, just getting bashed around a little bit in the wind here. So just clearing the tops of the trees, coming off the power. Hold the aircraft off. It's a stall warning, there's touchdown. As I say, we'll carry a bit of speed up the hill here, so coming back up on the power. That warning's just for the trim, so we'll cancel that. And just making it over the crest of the hill, come onto the brakes. You can unlock the tail wheel. And just being very careful as we taxi here. There are some rocks around in the parking area which definitely upset the aircraft. Again, that big long nose making it really tricky to see over, a little bit like a warbird in that respect. We'll just get ourselves clear of the runway and then we'll carry out our aft landing checks. So it looks like we've cleared most of the rocks in and around the parking area. Swing the aircraft around. And park brake can come back on, come back to idle power. The aft landing check, stabiliser trim is neutral. Idle control lever can come back to the low idle position. Tail wheel, it's already been set to steer. Flaps can come up. And the flaps are up. Anti-ice is off. Ignition switch is off. Prop de-ice is off. For the shutdown, we'll set the tail wheel to lock. Power lever is at idle. Parking brake is set. Landing lights are off. Cockpit and cabin fans are off. Generator switch is off. Again, we'll just cancel the caution there. The engine shutdown will come into feather on the prop. And the propeller control lever can come back to the idle cutoff position. So we'll just ungate that and bring it back to idle cutoff. Just waiting for NG to go below 5%. And then we can get the auxiliary fuel pump off. We'll cancel the warning once again. Say generator low voltage, we'd expect that of course. So NG now below 5%, auxiliary fuel pump can come off. Again cancelling the caution. Beacon can come off, as can the nav lights. And lastly we'll get the battery master off. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our short Indonesian cargo run in the MILVIZ PC-6 Porter. As I mentioned on the departure, I think for me this again really typifies what the sim is capable of, a really good fun flight with some challenging terrain and weather. To my mind the PC-6 fits in very nicely with the sim, and again a really good aircraft to have if you're into your air haulers, FS economies, things of that nature. As usual, I'll try and break down the aircraft into some positives and negatives. I'm going to try and keep it fairly short and sweet today, as I think overall it's quite clear that the MILVIZ PC-6 is a very decent add-on. During the conclusion we'll also look at a couple more flight manoeuvres, namely a stall, and we'll also try out putting the aircraft into the beta range. As usual we'll start off with the negatives, work our way through to the positives. Really for me at the moment there's only 2.5 major negatives that I can see standing out with the aircraft. The first one is the very typical overly sensitive rudder on the takeoff. Again, not necessarily MILVIZ's fault, as we do see that with most aircraft in the sim, but nonetheless the aircraft does exhibit that behaviour and it does make it quite tricky to take off in. It's really the only significant flaw with the aircraft's flight model that I was able to find during my testing. So as usual, whether it's for Asobo to fix or MILVIZ to develop the aircraft further, it would be really nice to see that behaviour reduced. It does make the aircraft a little bit less enjoyable in terms of the takeoff, less so with the landing. The other significant issue, obviously the autopilot not really behaving as one would hope at the moment, and the reason I say it's 2.5 negatives, really the fact that the aircraft uses the default autopilot, the default G1000 at the moment. I think that's what's causing most of our issues. It's not ideal, neither of them are very good. Again though, MILVIZ do state that with the next stable release of the working title mod, the aircraft will be compatible with that. Again, it's not ideal, but probably overall it's the right decision from MILVIZ, given that we've seen many times in the sim developers working with mods that are currently being updated and then the aircraft being broken as a result. At least this way we know for the most part the aircraft's going to work as intended. So again, the two big negatives, the rudder input during the takeoff and the fact that the aircraft uses the default Asobo avionics. The only other smaller gripe that I have with the aircraft, the default camera views don't seem to be ideal to me. They're not quite in the right place, but obviously that's workable as a user, and overall that's just my opinion. Moving on to the positives, again I have a lot of good things to say about the aircraft overall. I certainly really enjoyed the flight. Once again, I think that MILVIZ have created an aircraft that really does have a lot of character, a lot of immersion. It really feels like the plane it's supposed to be. Some developers have a real talent for creating quite an intangible quality to an add-on aircraft, and I think MILVIZ is certainly one of those developers. The vast majority of the modelling and texturing throughout the aircraft, again I think done to a high standard, particularly internally, which for me is always more important. I like all of the little attentions to detail, for example the chocks, the tie-downs, the engine covers, things of that nature. We've become pretty used to having them now in the sim. I certainly would expect to see them there, but nonetheless it is nice to see. And as I say, for me, one of my favourite features in terms of the visual model is just having the ability to load that cargo on and off. I think that's a really nice touch. We didn't really touch on the sounds much throughout the flight, but overall I thought the aircraft sounds were very good. Certainly internally the engine sounded about right, and all of the cockpit controls and switches had appropriate sounds there. Externally I thought much the same, the engine sounds were really rather good. Systems wise, once again a very nice effort from MILVIZ. As I said, pretty much every switch in the cockpit seemed to function. I was certainly able to operate the aircraft within the bounds of the checklist. MILVIZ themselves do state that the product only works within the bounds of what Asobo allows in terms of turboprop engine modelling, but overall the product does seem to be above and beyond the default turboprops within the sim. And whilst I'm not entirely sure as to how accurate the aircraft systems are compared with the real-world PC-6, certainly the system's depth was good enough to give an immersive and convincing experience of operating the little Porter. Flight model, with the exception of the rudder input during the takeoff, was again very good, very convincing. Probably now is a good time to just take a little bit more of a look at that, so as I say, we'll carry out a power on stall. We'll get the aircraft into the beta range as well, we'll take a look at a descent using that, and I'll come back to you again with my last few positive points for the product before we close up. So we're back up at 9,000 feet, just out to the east of Bugalaga at the moment. Just before I close up with my final remarks for the review, I thought we'd try a couple of manoeuvres. First thing we'll try is a stall, just to see how that's modelled with the aircraft. MILVIZ with their Corsair currently have the best modelling in terms of stalling within the sim, so it'll be quite interesting to see. And then finally we're going to attempt to put the aircraft into the beta range of the prop. That's this little party trick as we mentioned earlier. We should be able to get around 3,000–4,000 feet per minute rate of descent out of the aircraft quite easily. So we'll first try power on stall just to gain a little bit more altitude. That'll give us some more altitude to play with later on in the beta range. So just pitching the nose up, we'll let the speed bleed off. We'll go for about 20 degrees there on the pitch. So coming back on the stick, there's the stall warning. Continuing to come back on the controls. Speed just coming through 55 knots. And a little bit of buffeting, the wing does drop. Entering into the spin, we'll close the throttle. Keeping the controls fully back here, the spin does develop, it's a fairly leisurely one. We release the controls and the aircraft recovers all by itself. Overall it's not quite on a par with the Corsair in terms of the stall modelling. As I say, that really is the best aircraft in the sim currently, but it's still very good. Anyway, as I said, finally we'll just try to put the prop into the beta range. My understanding is to do that we just come back on the airspeed. We'll keep the prop RPM nice and high. Ultimately that's going to create a lot of drag through the prop, and then we should just be able to pitch the aircraft down, maintaining a reasonable airspeed and getting a really high rate of descent out of the aircraft. Just let that speed keep coming back. Can't feel the drag kicking in just yet. Okay, I think I can feel it kicking in now. So we'll pitch the aircraft down. As you can see, we're getting about 2,500 feet per minute rate of descent there at the moment, maintaining around 75–80 knots. So you can definitely get the aircraft into quite a steep approach, and I'm sure you can do steeper as well given the right conditions. It's not something I'm very used to doing in an aircraft. In fact, I've never done it in a real aircraft, but nonetheless the drag does seem to be modelled, and MILVIZ do state they've modelled that within the bounds of what's possible with default turboprop modelling in the sim currently. So as you'll have seen throughout the video and those couple of clips, overall I think the flight modelling of the PC-6 is very decent. Again, certainly the aircraft feels as I would expect it might. I can't judge as to how accurate it is compared with the real-world aircraft performance, but again, overall it seems very plausible. Overall it seems to me that once again MILVIZ have put a lot of care and attention into the aircraft. It has a lot of nice little features that we don't see in other add-ons. For example, you can actually hot start the engine, and I'm not entirely sure as to the damage modelling. I didn't get too much of a chance to test that. But for example, I did manage to induce a chip detection fault during one of my startup attempts, so presumably there is some sort of damage modelling going on there. Anyway, all in all, as I say, I think the MILVIZ PC-6 Porter, another excellent add-on from MILVIZ, a really nice addition to the sim, and I think very fairly priced as well. For me, once again, the aircraft is really well suited to the FS economy type add-ons that people like to use. The aircraft has a useful load of around 1,000 kilos, and again, great stall capabilities for getting in and out of those smaller strips. Capable as well in terms of clearing high terrain, but once again you aren't going to be going anywhere in a hurry. In conclusion, minus a couple of bugs, a really nice addition to the sim from MILVIZ. Hopefully they will fix up the Autopilot and we'll get the working title mod compatibility at a later date. Certainly with their Corsair there were some really nice additions to the aircraft after its release, so I'm sure we'll get the same treatment with the PC-6. Certainly if you're looking for a really solid cargo hauler, a STOL aircraft that's been modelled very nicely with very decent systems and flight modelling, then I would say that the MILVIZ PC-6 Porter is well worth a look. Anyway guys, as always I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you'd like to see more content, then consider subscribing to the channel as well. If you have any comments or questions for me, again you can leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll always do my best to answer them. As always, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support, and thank you very much as well to MILVIZ for letting us take a look at the PC-6. Take really good care, guys. I hope you all have a great day wherever you are, and I will see you all again soon.